interval training puzzle in soccer, part 1. In this first part, we're going to start by discussing the relevance of fitness for overall football performance. We're then going to realize that there are likely many ways to skin a cat, as my good mate Paul Lawson has been used to say, when it comes to selecting the right type of high-intensity training. And we're gonna go briefly into the insight that we can gain from the general principle of tactical periodization, even though it's probably way more complex than what we're gonna talk about today. But I'm gonna use this paradigm of training to move on and try to select better the training tools that we have in our toolbox. And finally, we're gonna discuss the different HIIT types in terms of objective at the physiological level and the different weapons or the different HIIT formats that we can apply during training. Those different weapons include high intensity training with long intervals, short intervals, repeated sprint training, and sprint interval training as well, that we're gonna pass by quick. And obviously the most important training weapon that we use mostly in football are obviously the small-sided games. So to start with, discussing the relevance of fitness for performance, and I would say that it's probably more complex than it seems. So first of all, it's important to realize that from a game to another game, there are sometimes more than 30% differences in the running output of the players, especially in terms of high intensity running distance, and that is always independent of the final outcome. So there are matches, players will run more and sometimes they will win, but sometimes they will run more and lose, and most often it's actually the case that the team that doesn't have much the ball and might be losing might actually run more. So it's difficult to say that you just have to run more and gonna win games because you're just running more. So the relationship between the physical output and the performance is actually not that straightforward. And there are also some evidences, as you can see on the bottom left, for example, those data showing a kind of relationship between the match score, the status of the match, and the running output. When teams are drawing or when the score is very tight, both teams tend to run more. But as soon as there are bigger differences in terms of goals, so one team is winning by a fair large amount of goals, and conversely the other is losing, both teams tend to run less, just because the results might be too difficult to change. So teams just kind of pace themselves and tend to run less. You could see on the bottom right side that as well, there are some clear differences in terms of running output depending on the system of play. So again, that shows that the context of the game most of the time dictates more running outputs than probably just the fitness of the players per se. And again, if we see, for example, on this video example of the style of play of Barcelona, for example, with their famous tiki-taka style of play, you see many examples of occasion of goals where, especially in these examples, we don't really see how fitness makes a difference in this kind of actions. What makes a difference are the tactical and technical alertness rather than purely physical outputs. I'm obviously not saying that doesn't matter, but there are many teams or many players that actually succeed without having an amazingly developed fitness, for example. To go a bit further into this example, these are data that we collected a while ago now in the Aspire Academy, where we looked at the effect of improvement in fitness over the year and how this improvement in fitness would relate to match running performance in those kids. So on the upper graph, you see the square representing the magnitude of the improvement in maximal aerobic speed in some key positions. So we selected on purpose for that only the players who showed a clear improvement in maximal aerobic speed, or VVO2 max, between the start and the end of the season. So those kids clearly got fitter by the end of the year, but as you can see, the match running performance between start of the season and end of the season, which is here represented via the black dots or the black triangles in relation to repeated high-speed sequences or repeated sprint high-intensity action during games, you see that those outputs during games did not change as much as the fitness did. So there was not a clear association between the improvement in fitness and the somewhat, sometimes improved, sometimes not improvement in running performance. So again, being fitter in that case did not translate directly into more or into better running performance, for example. Interestingly as well, if you look at the bottom graph, in this case we have selected the players who, for different reasons, showed a clear decrease in maximal aerobic speed at the end of the season. So some of them have been injured or they couldn't play for different reasons, so they actually got detrained at the end of the season. For those kids, if there were a clear association between fitness and game output, we would expect that the running output would have dropped similarly as their fitness. But in that case, as you can see, the fitness dropped, but the running performance during games increased actually. It increased because they had to match the running demands of their teammates who got fitter. But in this case, they lost fitness, but they were still able to do more on the pitch. So again, that shows that fitness per se doesn't dictate match activities during games. Obviously, having to do more, being less fit, will influence the internal cost, and obviously those kids will probably exercise at a higher relative intensity, which will likely induce greater fatigue that could affect cognitive decision, skill, and so on. But at least the absolute output isn't directly related to the fitness level. So I like to say that obviously being fit or fast in football doesn't guarantee success, for sure, but on the other side, players that are not fit enough at least to do the job can struggle at sometimes. So physical output is likely not a factor of success, but it can help definitely, and there's probably a balance to find in terms of training, in terms of profile, to be able to do at least at minimum the job that is required. So if you rank the importance of physical capacities or physical qualities and technical qualities overall, obviously we will have skills first, players' interaction, the ability to play with the teammates, game insights, so what we call as well decision-making abilities. And again, to summarize a little bit, so elite football players are probably not needed to be as fit or the fittest athletes as is required for track and field, for example, but at least they need, within their profile, within their overall technical and tactical proficiency, they need to be fit or fast enough to cope with the demands of the match, to be able to execute their role efficiency. And then it comes to more realizing of the importance of fitness at an individual level. Some players will definitely benefit of a lot of additional high-intensity training that will make them fitter and that will translate into clearly better performance. There might be other players that don't need such an important training because they're just playing via other means and through game insight and technique, for example. So again, taking a bit further this option in terms of individualizing the metabolic conditioning work, I'd like to look at, on one side, player profile in terms of physical output, physical qualities, but also, as we discussed, technical and tactical awareness, and put that in relation to his game demands. Game demands in terms of where does he play, in terms of position, in terms of playing style, in terms of playing standard. And then we can just have kind of a cost-benefit approach, thinking, okay, this player, that's what he is, what he can do at the moment. These are the requirements from the game. Is he fit enough to do the job at the moment? Fine, we just need to prepare him. Is he maybe missing a little bit of fitness? Okay, can we take this player, can we improve the fitness of this player for him to match the required demands? If that's feasible, no problem, we'll move on. If that's too difficult, if we believe that at that time, at this moment, the player will actually struggle to really meet the playing standard or the demands, we could maybe, again, with a cost-benefits approach, thinking he might just need to change position. So there are positions, obviously, as you are well aware, that require less running, for example, or maybe dropping playing standard, playing at a lower level in certain circumstances might be less demanding in terms of physical demands. But for the players who are actually still in the process and we believe that they're going to play at this level and we just need to implement the right training, then we just have to think which are the priorities in terms of physical development. Some players will need probably a more emphasis and focus on strength and speed, and others might benefit or might need more conditioning or high-intensity training. And that's when the high-intensity training puzzle comes into play. But again, I would say that the greater the individualization, the more impactful the program. And I'd like to finish with a kind of it's kind of an example of what the activity profile of a player would look like based on different conditioning levels. So on the first example on the top panel of the slide, you see typically how the player will be able to repeat high intensity efforts throughout the game when he's poorly conditioned, so probably after a break, or the case of a player with a poor maximal aerobic speed, for example. So as you can see, the ability of that player to repeat the same effort with the same high intensity kind of decrease with the time in the game. So because of the fatigue, because of his inability to repeat and recover, the quality of these efforts decrease, and the longer, the less frequent those efforts. If we take the example of a player that is fit, but still, as we call, generically fit, so a big level of fitness, but he hasn't still done much specific types of conditioning. So fitness is there, so he's able to repeat those efforts, but the quality still drops a little bit, and the occurrence is still not as we wished. And the last example, which is the case of a fit and specifically conditioned athlete. So when I talk about generic versus specific, I would say that generic is more about being fit in general through generic type of exercise. So running could be cycling, could be rowing, so a kind of developed general fitness versus a specific fitness, which is more ability to repeat football actions, if you want. So in that case, a player that is fit to compete through specific fitness will show the profile on the bottom graph, with the ability to repeat and to maintain the intensity of each bout with both quality and high frequency. So that's obviously the goal, and we're going to discuss the different types of training that could lead us to take the players into that types of activities. So when it comes to implement in practice high-intensity training, again, I really like to use this expression that there are many ways to skin a cat. As I said, that I took that from my colleague Paul Lawson, who took that himself from his former PhD supervisor, Nigel Septo, when back in the days, probably close to 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago, they were discussing about what would be the best ways to train athletes. In their case, it was about cycling, but again, irrespective of the sport, we have all the same question. What do we implement in terms of training, high-intensity training? So if we think about a typical training week, for example, and I've used a generic type of periodization as an example within that week, where you have a game over the weekend, a day off, a recovery days, and then building up a little bit the load throughout the week. Most of the time, practitioners implement high-intensity training in the middle of the week. Could be on the third day after the game, or the 3 days before the game. Could be on the 4th day. So midweek, that's most of the time when people implement this type of training. But then the question is, what do actually we do on that day? Are we using repeated long intervals, 2-3 minutes? Are we using short intervals? Are we using repeated sprints? Are we using sprint interval training? Are we using small-sided games? Are we using a combination of 2 or 3 of those? It's a great question. And we're going to try to think about different approaches to help us to make better decisions when it comes to select the best conditioning format. So I'm going to just go through a few videos of examples of all those typical formats, as we call the weapons sometimes, the weapons to hit those physiological targets. So in this example, you see an athlete doing long intervals on a treadmill. Obviously, long intervals can be performed with any types of exercise mode. Could be running, obviously closer to our activity, but could also be done on a bike, on an ergo cycle, and so on. You see here some players doing a kind of a specific long intervals, which is in the end a small-sided games, and on the side you see another group doing some short running intervals. That's very practical example where you see in this case the players were actually alternating the two types of conditioning. So one group was doing the small-sided games, the other group was doing the high-intensity running, and they were just switching so that they could get a bit of both types of stimulus. That's an example taken from some of the handball players I was coaching a while ago. In this case, the groups were split into, on one side, repeated sprint training, and on the other side, short intervals as well. And as you just saw for the football players before, those handball players were kind of alternating. So they were doing a set of one and then switching and doing a set of both. So these are examples among others of direct implementations of those different formats in athletes. But again, as I said, now the question is to find some solutions or some guidelines to know better which types of formats to select. And I think there's probably a first good way to understand the question is when we look at the long-term effects of all these different types of interval. And for that, I have summarized into that slide, into one single slide, all the longitudinal studies that I conducted throughout the last 15 years with mostly a same type of population, and that's why I managed to put all those data together, because all those interventions were actually conducted in the same population of highly trained under 18, under 17 handball players. So the population is very homogeneous, and as a coach, I've been trying, as you could see on those videos, I've been trying and comparing most of those formats. So a year, for example, I had two teams, or I had two groups within my training team, two groups, and both of them were actually, one was doing some short intervals, the other one was doing some high intensity sprints. Then the year after, I was testing two others modalities, and the year after others. So it took me several years to be able to test all the different modalities and to compare all of them. So when we put everything together, as you can see here, in terms of the longitudinal improvements, in terms of physical performance, at the level of the 30-15 intermittent fitness test that I will describe a bit further, but here we take the 30-15 as a measure of high-intensity intermittent performance, running performance, so more aerobic, metabolic aspect, and also some results on a repeated sprint test. And as you can see, short intervals, you have A and B because we had two types of short intervals. The first were more 10-10, 15-15. The B is more 20-20, 30-30, but they were still short intervals. You see, for those, the improvement is it's actually a moderate type of improvement if we look for both high-intensity running and repeated sprint. For repeated sprint training, we have almost the same effect. For sprint interval training, so long sprint, again, we have an effect as well. On a bit further on the right, or extreme right, we have small-sided games, and again, you see both types of performance improved. The only training that did not improve both 30-15 and repeated sprint was actually a training based just on speed, and that makes complete sense, because in that case, the speed training improved repeated sprint ability via the improvement of the initial sprint performance, but obviously, quality sprint training did not improve the performance at the 30-15, which makes total sense. But what I want to kind of summarize with those slides is that in the end, irrespective of the format used, we got more or less the same improvement. So the years I've been using short intervals, other years I've been using repeated sprint and different combination, most of the time I got my players at the same level of fitness at the end of these 6 weeks training periods. And I think that's pretty important, and that goes back to this the sentence like there's many ways to skin a cat, is that in these conditions, when you have highly trained players who train every day within the context of their own their sport, when we add different types of high-intensity training, whatever we add, we end up more or less with the same results. So just saying that, we could just believe, okay, fair enough, then doesn't matter. We can just throw in whatever we want every day and we will get the player fitter. True, in terms of overall fitness development, likely. There might be not clear differences between the use of short intervals, small-sided games, or repeated sprint, for example, in terms of development. But I like to think that we can go a bit further and think a bit more about maybe taking into account the acute responses of those different formats and how they fit into the microcycles in terms, especially in terms of interferences with the other training that are around. Or, you know, when we discuss the concurrent adaptation, for example, or how those sessions affect game readiness. Like, for example, if we are thinking about implementing this high-intensity training session on a Wednesday, but players may have done some strength work on the Tuesday, or they will do something on a Thursday, there may be something to consider at this moment about what is the most appropriate high-intensity training format for the Wednesday, so that we don't compromise the strength adaptation, or we don't compromise the quality of the speed session that might be done the day after. So this is probably the best way to consider those types of acute responses during these intervals and to see how they actually fit into the overall training puzzle within the microcycle. So if you ask different coach, for example, what would you implement today as a high-intensity session, you will probably get as many responses as their coaches. If you ask maybe a running coach or a track and field coach, and you just ask him, can you just offer a high-intensity running session to improve VO2 max, he'll probably suggest, as you can see on this graph, if you look at the sessions on the extreme left or those in the middle, they will probably come with long intervals, with some active recovery in between. And as you can see here, those sessions will actually last 25, 30, or 40 minutes, as you can see in the session in the middle. So those sessions are very likely efficient to develop the VO2 max. They are probably efficient in this context, but we as a fitness coach in football, can we really use those types of sessions that last 40 minutes to fit in our training content? I guess no. And as you know, if we can devote a little bit of time for high-intensity training, probably 10, 15 minutes maximum. So most of the sessions, and that's probably a first way to understand and to make some choices in terms of which types of training to choose, that most of the time using long intervals, as in those examples, is just most of the time not appropriate for our purpose, just because we don't have time, for example. But further than that, in those examples, if you look at the blue columns, the blue column shows the total distance that is covered during those different sessions. And if you look at those sessions with long intervals, players will have to cover for some of them, about 7 to even 8 kilometers just for the conditioning part. Again, in the context of football, when we try to maintain and to control the overload, if we consider that a typical session in the middle of the week will be between 6 and 8 kilometers already, if it's a heavy session, how could we add on the top of that 6 more kilometers just to condition players? So that's not about only time, but about overall running volume, about neuromuscular load of those sessions. And as you can see on the extreme right of the graph, if you consider small-sided games, obviously total distance is not the best measure of the constraints during small-sided games, and obviously you could relate those evaluations to the other lectures on small-sided games and all the tracking lectures as well. But still, in terms of neuromuscular demands and overall activity with small-sided games, you probably get your fitness dose within 10 minutes, 10-12 minutes, with a pretty limited amount of extra external load, for example. So in that case, and that's the goal of that slide. If you look now at the white, the left green and white columns on the left of the session, you see in white the time spent during those sessions in the red zone. And as you see, irrespective of the overall length of those sessions, so it could be small-sided games overall 10-12 minutes, could be a long interval session of 40 minutes, all those sessions allow the athletes to spend more or less 8 minutes in their zones. That means that you have some sessions like small-sided games that are very, very efficient. In a short period of time, athletes spend these 8 minutes in their zone. So it's very efficient. They get a lot in terms of cost benefit again. While for those long interval sessions, player or athletes in this case, they run, they exercise for 40 minutes, but they still spend only 8 to 10 minutes in their own zones. So again, it's not a session is better than another, but into the context of football, which is interesting to know is that using small-sided games, for example, can be as efficient if we consider the time spent in the red zone, which means close to VO2 max, which is the time that really matters in terms of adaptation. We can have the same very efficient time in 10 minutes than track and field runner will spend when they do their 40-minute sessions. Obviously, runners do those long sessions probably for other matters, like they need to accumulate volume, which is another story. But again, in this context, that's a first way to understand and make decisions on which types of sessions are more appropriate for our purpose. I'd like to see as well to consider the overall approach in terms of thinking as we discussed the two-spaced tube theory. The theory of the two-spaced, I kind of like this funny analogy, is that when you want to get the two-spaced out of the tube, at some stage, when you get less two-spaced in the tube, you're going to have to press clearly on one side to get the two-spaced out. When the toothpaste is brand new, you can press anywhere, you get something out. But when it gets a bit less full, you need to press at the right place. And that's a bit the analogy that we can do with training. And the more elite, the greater the training status, the more precise needs to be the stimulus. And in that side, if you just keep doing a little bit of everything, if you keep mixing all the type of contents during your sessions, like typically a strength based training, like you do 30 seconds of push-up, 30 seconds of jump, 30 seconds of squat and so on, so like a very generic type of circuit, you might not be able to target strength, you might not be able to target properly the cardiovascular system and so on. So there are at some stage, and that's probably more my vision of things, but at some stage you'd better do a proper gym session and then a proper high intensity running session that will really hit the red zone and make sure you really target the metabolic system and the cardiovascular system at high rates. So just think about this example. Sometimes, and especially with elite athletes, you'd better be precise and to make sure you really hit the right targets. And to go further into this idea of making sure you have the puzzle right and that you really hit the right targets, if we think about the overall concurrent training paradigm, and that actually make relation to how strength and metabolic conditioning can actually be targeted together or not. So what we know is that when we implement strength training only, the adaptation occurs within a few days and weeks, and most of the time it's linked to both the quality of the session and then what happens at the muscle level and all the molecular and the growth factor into the muscle. So the quality during the session and then what happens in terms of growth internally. When a proper speed or strength session is actually done just after or before a high-intensity running session, a metabolic session that causes fatigue, there might be what we call interferences. And most of the time, if the high intensity session is done before the strength session, it's possible that the quality of the strength session might be lower, so that the velocities and the load during that strength session might not be as high or as fast as they should be or used to be. And then that could decrease the actual stimulus for improving strength or speed. That can be problematic in our context. Or the other option will be to be able to do the strength first, quality strength, but then after we have, in that case, a high intensity training session, metabolic. And this, even though the quality of the strength session would have been good, the fact that we have this strength session after, that could affect what happened in the muscle in terms of signaling in the cell in the muscle. And that may actually interfere with muscle growth. So irrespective of the timing of those sessions, there are possibilities sometimes that the high intensity session might actually impair the adaptation that we are after with proper speed and strength session. And that's why we need to consider the timing and the location of this high intensity training session in relation to strength and speed, but also the format of those sessions so that they create the least interference possible in this context, so that we can keep developing both strength, speed and power and the metabolic aspects. And that's really the idea of the puzzle. And that's when we're going to need to go a bit further into better understanding the demands of these high intensity training sessions.